St. Thomas Aquinas and natural law and the four laws. In regards to natural law, as Aquinas sees it, since humans were created by God to live a certain way, then one could reflect on human nature, and this could reveal guidelines for actualizing human potentialities. So his view was we could infer morality by observing what humans are like. That would tell us what humans have in terms of their potentialities, and that would tell us, given his view of teleology, what humans should do. Now, going back to our notion of the spectrum of morality, ranging from absolutism to nihilism, Aquinas would be an objectivist, because he believes that as human nature remains the same across cultures and times, the rules of natural law would be universal. He also believed they are self-evident, and he takes what is good to be what is in accord with reason, and reason conforms to natural law. And so, by reflecting on human nature and our natural inclinations, we could, at least according to Aquinas, infer moral principles. That is, we could get a ought from what is, what we ought to do from what is the case. And later philosophers, such as David Hume, took issue with that. Now, in regards to the natural morality, to give an example of how he would use this method, he notes that all creatures naturally tend to preserve their own lives. That is to say, things try to avoid dying. And from this he infers that murder and suicide is wrong, because life, given the way things behave, is to be preserved. As another example, he notes that all animals seek to preserve their species and protect their children, or so it claims. Now, for humans, this would include helping our young develop to their full potential. And so, given that creatures behave like this, he infers this is how we should behave, what we should do. Now, in addition to staying alive and protecting our species, etc., he also notes that we're above animals, and so we're inclined, he claims, to develop our rational human potential. And this, he takes, leads to a duty to seek truth and follow the rules that we need to live in society. And so his basic idea is we can infer what we should do from our nature. And going back to part one, the moral methods, when we talked about the unnatural argument and the natural argument, I mentioned that Aquinas had this view that there is a natural order to things, and following the natural order is correct, and breaking it is wrong. And here we see this made good upon. Now, one obvious concern, of course, is that there's disagreement about ethics. If you travel around the world, or even around the block, you'll find people who disagree about the morality of particular actions, or types of actions. For example, someone may be pro-choice, one other person is pro-life. Someone may be morally appalled at, harming people in any form, against capital punishment, abortion, and war. Someone else may agree about, say, abortion, but be willing to have people killed in the course of war or capital punishment. And so Aquinas has to explain this disagreement, given that, at least on his view, natural law is universal and self-evident. So what's his reason? Well, his reason is that some people are blinded by their passions, or influenced by bad habit, or they wallow in ignorance, and hence do not know these self-evident moral truths. So people who do not see the natural law fail to do so because of limits or defects. So how do we actually determine what we should and shouldn't do? Or from a practical standpoint, Aquinas brings forth the notion of the conscience. So in many ways he's like the classic and great moral philosopher Jiminy Cricket, who said, of course, let your conscience be your guide. And as he sees it, the conscience is a rational activity, and it involves applying moral knowledge to particular cases. And he believes that a will that's at variance with reason, that is to say is not acting in accord with reason, whether it gets things right or wrong, is always evil. And as we'll see, this is somewhat similar to the view put forth by Socrates that we'll see later, namely that evil is a matter of ignorance. Now, in terms of following our conscience, his view is that we're obligated to follow our informed conscience as well as possible. And this adds a couple interesting factors to consider. One is the informed conscience. The idea is basically that we just can't profess ignorance and engage in willful ignorance. Our conscience has to be properly informed. The second point is it's as well as possible. So what occurs if we are mistaken? We make an error. Well, as he sees it, if we make a mistake in terms of, trying to follow our conscience, he believes that a person should be judged on how well they followed the moral light as they saw it, provided they, are following an informed conscience. So this allows someone to be wrong because of, some sort of mistake, yet, as long as they operate by their informed conscience and act in accord with what they believe to be correct, then they would be judged on those conditions, which is a somewhat interesting approach. Now, we take a look at the 4 laws. In terms of how this ties into metaphysics, and again, metaphysics is, roughly put, the study of the structure and nature of reality. It deals with the big questions of what there is. Now, as Aquinas sees it, the moral law in our nature is an expression of another law, namely God's eternal law. Now, getting back to the intellectualism, the moral law is not arbitrary. It's not simply God willing whatever. It's the result of God's reason, grounded in his nature. And since God is not an arbitrary being, the moral law is also not arbitrary. So, the law is willed by God because it is good. It is not good because he wills it. Now we'll take a look at the 4 types of laws Aquinas considers. The first is the eternal law, which is the rational order that God has established and ordained for the created world. And as Aquinas sees it, everything follows this law. Non-rational beings, like rocks and trees and stars and planets and so forth, they simply follow the law. They just go along. Now, insofar as we're physical beings just acting in accord with, say, physics and biology, we just follow those laws. But, since we have free choice, we can choose to obey or disobey the moral aspects of the law, so we can break those laws. Now, there's also the natural law, which was mentioned earlier. This is law that we can discern through reason. We can examine the world empirically, and, at least according to Aquinas, see what this law is. And this law supposedly regulates our ethics, our moral behavior. It guides us, as he sees it, insofar as we are natural and social beings. Now, in terms of getting beyond the natural law, there is also the divine law. This is known not by empirical investigation or even by direct application of reason. It's known by revelation. That is to say, it's revealed to people. This goes beyond the natural law and guides human beings, at least as Aquinas sees it, towards eternal happiness. And by following the divine law, the natural virtues, those put forth and accepted by Aristotle and then adopted by Aquinas, are exceeded or added to with additional virtues. Specifically, the natural virtues are sort of augmented extensively by theological virtues, which include faith, hope, and love. Now, unlike the natural virtues, which are required pretty much the way Aristotle saw them in terms of habituation, the virtues that are theological in nature can only be attained by God's grace. So again, what we have essentially with Aquinas is a layer cake. The base sort of foundation is Aristotle's natural ethics. Then on top of that, we have, in addition to the natural law, we have, at least according to Aquinas, the divine law, which adds the additional Christian element to this cake. Now, the final type of law is human law, and these are laws created by us, created by humans. Now, in terms of how these relate to the eternal law, as Aquinas sees it, in the laws we create, there's nothing in them that is just or lawful but what we get from the eternal law. So the foundation for what is correct and just and so forth in our human laws is drawn from the eternal laws. And to the degree that our laws are defective and screwed up, they do not draw from the eternal law. So that brings us an end to looking at sort of the general view of laws in St. Thomas Aquinas. And next we'll turn to look at some specific excerpts from his major work, the Summa Theologica.